record these. So any questions on anything before we get going on presentations? Final exam, homework that's due on, when is homework due? Monday? Homework that's due on Monday. Anything for questions there at all? People are shaking their heads at me. Okay, we're going to assume that those are all good. So we've got presentations today. I am going to time you guys, and if you hit 12 minutes, I will send you a private message just that you're at 12 minutes and to start to think about wrapping it up. But otherwise, I'm just going to let you go, and then we'll do a little bit of time for questions at the end. Remember, people who are observing feedback forms, you're responsible for doing 5 over the course of these presentations. Any questions before we get going with virtual presentations? The first time I've ever done this. Okay, Laura, then you can get going. You can go first. I'm trying to find my stopwatch here. And you can share your screen. Perfect. All right. Whenever you're ready, all yours. Go ahead.
All right. So I will be talking to you guys about the cipher of Mary, Queen of Scots. I personally think her cipher had a lot of shortcomings, but I will let you guys decide that for yourselves as we talk about her life and her cipher. So for a quick outline of what I'm going to run through, I'm going to quickly go through her early years and her return to Scotland, but I'm mainly going to focus on her imprisonment in England and on her cipher. So, her life. A couple key themes to think about while I talk about this is the Protestant and Catholic conflicts that are kind of happening throughout, Mary's unsuccessful marriages, and fighting for power in general. So, before Mary was born and right around when she was born, there was a power struggle between England and Scotland. England was invading and trying to take the throne, and that caused Mary's father a lot of emotional and mental turmoil, which he eventually died from. So Mary became Queen of Scotland as an infant. And so suitors lined up for power and political reasons because they wanted to marry into the throne. And since the king had just died, they thought invading would be kind of rude at that point. So when she became of age, she would marry someone. The Scottish nobles, however, thought that marrying the prince from France would be the best idea for her when she was old enough. So for her safety, she moved to France, and she became a Catholic while she was there, which is important to note for later on. So she married the prince, but he had been sickly his whole life, so he died soon after they got married, which is pretty sad. So Mary returned back to Scotland, but while she was gone, the Scottish people became strongly Protestant, and she was now Catholic, so she kind of had to win back their affections after that. She ended up marrying her cousin, and he was just a terrible, terrible guy. She didn't feel safe with him. He was violent, power hungry. It was just terrible. So he ended up dying in a mysterious house explosion and was strangled before he could get out of the house. So was it Mary? Was it the Scottish nobles? I don't know, but seems kind of fishy to me. But Mary got remarried after that. But the Scottish nobles, specifically the Protestant ones, didn't want her on the throne anymore because she was Catholic, so she was forced to abdicate. Her half-brother became steward of the throne until Mary's son would be of age to take it, and she was thrown in jail, and her husband fled somewhere and ended up dying later on. But after a while, some of the people loyal to her were able to break her out of prison, but Mary realized that her forces wouldn't be strong enough to retake the throne, so she needed to escape the country. She wanted to go back to France, but she would have to go through her half-brother's territory to do that, which would be too dangerous, so she fled to England to seek refuge with her cousin. But her cousin, Queen Elizabeth, threw her in jail right away, and she was in jail for a total of 18 years. And so she wasn't really in jail. She was actually in a series of manors and castles although her jailer wasn't very nice to her, she didn't have a lot of freedoms or rights. If she wrote letters out, they were confiscated and she couldn't get mail in. But luckily, in January of 1586, toward the end of her prison time, a man named Gilbert Gifford offered himself to her as a courier. So he would gather up all of her mail, hide it in a barrel. The barrel would be delivered to where she was staying, and her servants would bring the letters to her. And a couple months later is when the Babington plot started. It all started with a guy named Anthony Babington. He was a young man. He was Catholic and from England. Although Catholics at that time were mistreated, so he wanted Elizabeth to be taken off of the throne and Mary to be put on it. So he wanted to break her out of prison. So he came up with a plan and he wrote to Mary using one of her ciphers. And this is the cipher that they used. Well, you might think that it's a simple substitution cipher because of the alphabet in it. It's actually a nomenclator because it is a series of keywords along with it too. And a couple things to note, we'll go through this later too, is that it's missing a J and it's also missing B and W. It's also a double letter character and some null characters and keywords that you would commonly use so that you wouldn't have to write them out all the time. And sadly, Gifford, her mailman, was secretly working for Queen Elizabeth. Before he offered his services to Mary, he went to Elizabeth's secretary and was like, hey, I can take you all of Mary's incoming and outgoing mail before actually delivering it so that you can read it. And they agreed, and so he was sharing all of Mary's mail with them. And eventually they came across the mail that was using ciphertext, so they brought in a guy named Philippe, and he was a master code breaker. It didn't really take him long to break the cipher. I don't know the exact timeline, but he was incredible at frequency analysis, so he used that on all of the letters, and he slowly identified the null characters and threw them out, and he figured out the alphabet and then guessed what the code words could be because they were really common words. So they let the letters go by because they really wanted to catch Mary and the people working with her. So Anthony Babington eventually sent a letter asking for Mary's blessing on their plan. And so they're like, yay, this is a chance we can catch Mary if she puts her seal of approval on it. And she did. So that sealed her fate. When they got that letter back, they're like, well, maybe we can catch the accomplices too. So they needed to ask for their names. And Philippe also just happened to be a master forger. So he wrote a postscript onto the letter asking for their names so that Mary could know who rescued her. And Babington didn't realize it was a forgery and replied with all of the names, and the story ends with everyone being executed. That's the end. So, the cipher. This is a nice nomenclator that she had used, so I'm going to run through a couple examples of things you might want to write. So, if you just want to write something that isn't a keyword like yes, it would end up looking like that, Y-E-S, just match them up, pretty simple. Keywords, so there, if you would want to write when it is dark, hide the key in my mailbox, it has a few keywords in there, like when, in, is, and my, so you would just substitute those in instead of writing them out using the actual alphabet there. If you'd want to say something with a double letter, like look for my signal, you have a double O in there. So you would use double before the letter you want doubled. So L, double O, K. So look. And as you can see that J, V, and W are both gone, or all gone, I should say. So if you want to say something like get me out of jail, you might want to replace the J with an I, which would look like this. You can see the two I's toward the end of the message. Otherwise, if you don't want to do something like that, because it could be confusing, just don't use words that have those letters in them. There's also null characters. null characters don't mean spaces, and when you use this cipher, you should not put spaces between your words. So this is just to make things a little bit more complicated for someone trying to crack your cipher. You can see the null characters on the left of your screen there. So this is the same message from last time, except I added in a couple null characters, which makes it a little bit longer, potentially more confusing because there's more characters in there that you'd have to figure out. I feel like this cipher could be improved with multiple levels of encryption, like using another cipher with it. I think the Vigenère cipher was invented by this time, not that Mary would have the resources to be able to study up on it and master it, but it was something that maybe she could have used. If she would have padded her messages, that also could have potentially helped. But the example I'm going to go through with you is a signature, because this would have saved the lives of the accomplices that would have been working with them. You know, signature schemes obviously weren't invented by this time. I think it was like the late 1900s when they were like actually used. So she'd have to use a pretty crude and simple one because she was living in the 1500s. So she could use something that would involve like the number of lines or characters that she used. So here's an example that I came up with. Mary could pick a secret number, like 4. Babington would also know this number. Might be a problem to exchange that number, but that's a whole nother issue. But Mary would count the number of plain text letters in what she wanted to send, the number of ciphertext characters in the coded message, and the number of lines in her letter, like lines of text going down. She would add her secret number to that, and then write it on the letter or envelope somewhere, hopefully somewhere where Philippe would think it's nothing and wouldn't really pay attention to it. And Babington would receive the letter and check that all of the numbers match with the fake number that she wrote on the letter. So all in all, Mary had a very tragic life, lots of time in jail, ended up dying in the end. She used a nomenclator as her cipher, which didn't turn out so well because it was no match for the master code breaker Philippe, and it could have been improved with more encryption or signature. Here are some of my sources if you're curious. Does anyone have any questions for me?
All right, anything for questions for Laura? Do you think, go ahead, yep.
Oh, maybe I missed this, but how did she and like who she was writing to agree on like what symbols and stuff like that?
Okay, so I wasn't sure about this either. All of the sources that I looked at didn't actually say how they exchanged the cipher. So I was kind of wondering about that too. But Mary actually wrote a lot of ciphers during her life. Apparently, one of my sources said that she experimented with like invisible ink and stuff. So yeah, I'm not sure how they exchanged it, but hopefully maybe one of her secretaries that was more trusting than her courier was able to hide it somewhere special. I'm not sure though. Good question though.
Cool.
Anybody else? Other questions? All right, thank you. Nicely done. We'll have you stop sharing your screen and either Ashley or Joshua can go next. Any takers? Ashley, Joshua, whoever wants to go next?
I can go next.
Okay. While Ashley is getting screen sharing set up, people who were supposed to be pre-recording and sending it to me, I sent you an email with how to upload stuff to YouTube. Let me know if that does not work and we will figure out the bugs in that process. But if you are pre-recording, the file will probably be too large to submit to Moodle, so you're gonna need to upload it to YouTube. All right. Okay, Ashley, let me get my timer reset and you are good to go.
All right, so the topic that I did my research on was Morse code. So before Morse code was invented, there were different communication forms, such as flag signals or light signals. Both of those required an observer who would decipher the signal from a tower, and then the message would be passed on from the next to the next station. And this process continued until it reached the intended receiver. So clearly this was very inefficient and slow, and the ability to intercept was relatively easy because basically all you had to do was be able to see the observers standing up on the towers and be able to know the different flag signals. So just for an example, this was what they did. Yeah, you can see that it would be pretty easy to intercept and obviously very long because it would go tower to tower to tower until the final person was reached. So luckily, this gentleman, Samuel Morse, who was born on April 27th, 1791, and then he passed away in 1872. He was an American inventor and painter, and he thought of the brilliant idea to improve communication through electricity. He didn't technically think of it, this wasn't super groundbreaking, but to him this was like, oh, I think I can do this. So he was in Europe and he was thinking about this on a ship, and he was like, I think we can do this through a wire. But he didn't really know anything about electricity. So he had this grand idea, but he couldn't accomplish it by himself. So luckily, he knew this gentleman named Leonard Gale, who was one of his colleagues. He lived from 1800 to 1883. He was a professor of chemistry, but he was also familiar with electrical work. And right before Samuel Morse came to him with the idea of passing messages through a wire, he had actually read an article that suggested the invention of the telegraph. So they're kind of already on the same page without really knowing it. So they teamed up in 1830 to 1834. They were working on this telegraph. And it took many years of trial and error, and they finally had a system that worked. So their hope was to apply for a federal grant, which would allow them to build different telegraph wires. Their initial one, they wanted it to be from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. However, the Panic of 1837 postponed this because the economy basically took a dump, and so they were not able to apply for federal money. Luckily, this actually gave them more time to just make sure their invention was the best that it could be. So they actually traveled to Europe again because basically the same things was happening in Europe. They were trying to come up with an electric telegraph as well. So they traveled back to Europe and they were looking at competitors' inventions, and they realized that theirs was superior based on how it worked and then the quickness of it. So when the economy was booming again, about in 1843, Morse and Gale finally asked Congress for the $30,000 to build a telegraph line from the Capitol building to Baltimore. And then this was successful. So in May of 1844, the first telegraph was sent, which was What Hath God Wrought, which I showed below. And Morse sent this to his building partner, Vail. Vail was basically a guy that helped with the expansion of the telegraph lines, and then he did end up coming up with a smaller model of the telegraph, but I'm not going to talk too much about him. But anyway, so Morse sent the first message to Vail, and it was successful. So here is a picture of the telegraph. As you can see, it's kind of bulky and large. But anyway, so it worked there's a transmitter that opened and closed the electric circuit, and then the electric current, the receiver used electric current at any point to establish a magnetic field, and then it printed out dots and dashes, which represented how long the circuit was open, and then these dots and dashes are printed onto moving paper tape by a stylus that was operated by an electromagnet. And then just for coding's sake, the duration of a dash is 3 times the length of a dot, and each word is separated by silence or a pause by the sender, which was equivalent to a dash. So I don't know a ton about how the telegraph worked because it's kind of confusing to me as well, but clearly Morse and Gale figured it out and it was successful. So with the dots and dashes, Morse came up with the American Morse code, which is shown here. And so the dots and dashes represented letters of the alphabet, and then the stylus only printed dots and dashes. So then this alphabet was used to decode the message. Yeah, so as you can see, it's just a monoalphabetic cipher. So there's one specific combination of dots and dashes for each letter. So if you knew what each letter was, you could easily figure out the message. So before people recognized like how loud and obnoxious the noise was, they had to take like the paper that the stylist printed out the dots and dashes on, then compare it to the Morse alphabet, and then write out the code. But since it was so loud, people decided that it would be easier to just start writing the message down by sound. So they quickly realized like the sound from a dot or a dash, and they were able to write out the message. So it became a lot more efficient. And then the picture on the right is the telegraph that like Vail came up with. So as you can see, it's a lot smaller and doesn't take up as much room as the original. So sending the telegrams was relatively secure, but because intercepting the messages was difficult. So as I said before, if you knew the Morse alphabet, you could easily decode any message that you got, which was basically the whole idea of the telegraph. It was to make communication easier, but it was difficult to actually like intercept messages because it required a lot more than just having a telegraph. So Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated and telegraph lines were being built across the country. This is part of like westward expansion. As everybody was moving west, telegraph lines are being built in the west as well. However, there were no direct lines to the War Department, but Lincoln was learning how to use the telegraph and he wanted direct access to it. So they built telegraph lines to the War Department. And Lincoln actually became like the first president to have direct communication with his troops because he wanted to be a hands-on leader. So he used the telegraph to communicate directly with his troops. And so that was obviously shown in the Civil War. So in the Civil War, the Union took advantage of over 15,000 miles of telegraph lines to communicate. The Confederacy had a smaller network, however, they did not use it as frequently. The Confederacy had like a stronger army overall, so they didn't really see like why they needed to use the telegraph lines because they thought they kind of like had it in the bag. However, the Union telegrams, like they were being sent frequently because Abraham Lincoln wanted to know everything about his troops and what was happening and how they could do better. So the Union telegrams were sent using Morse code. It was the universal language at the time, and everybody basically knew how to operate a telegraph. So if the Confederacy had the means to intercept the messages, they could have. However, that required tapping wires, and it was difficult because the wires were 6 feet in the ground, and they'd have to establish different antennas and everything. So it was just very complicated, and the Confederacy didn't really see the advantage to this. And then also, just a quick note, many historians believe the telegraph may have led to the Confederacy's defeat, which I thought was really cool because I feel like that's not something I've ever learned in the history class, so that was just a neat little thing to learn. So then in World War I, telegraph lines are now like well established throughout America and Europe. So as I mentioned before, when like the telegraph was being invented in America, it was also being used and like implemented in Europe. So when westward expansion was happening in America, in Europe, this was going to different countries at the same time. And then there was also the transatlantic line, which connected America and Europe. And that's what's shown on the right. That's like how thick the wire was because it had to go through the ocean. So I thought that was kind of cool. And then the telegraph was the quickest form of communication. So that's obviously the push for implementing the lines everywhere. And it was used to communicate from like the frontline trenches to officers, and then also between nations, because obviously now that it's a world war, it's not just one country against itself, it's multiple countries against multiple countries. So they needed the advantage of the telegraph to communicate more efficiently instead of sending boats back and forth. However, there were slight differences because there was the international version of Morse code and then the American version of Morse code, which there were some differences, which I'll show in my next slide. And also at this time in Germany, the universal distress signal was created, 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, or SOS. And no, it does not mean save our ship or anything else like that. It is simply just a distress signal because it's easy to remember, and that is all. So yeah, so as I mentioned before, these are the slight differences. So the international Morse code is on the left, and then the American Morse code is on the right. So I kind of just highlighted the differences. So clearly this would make it easy or harder to intercept messages as well, depending on which alphabet was being used to decipher the messages. And so here, in conclusion, the telegraph was created to enhance communication. So the Morse alphabet was created so telegrams could be understood by anyone who owned a telegraph. So that's why it was simple. And then if intercepted, the message could easily be decoded because there's a mono-alphabetic cryptosystem. And then more complicated codes were created to make communication more secure. However, they required completely different telegraph machines. So that was basically why everybody just used Morse code at the very beginning, because that was the one telegraph machine. But as time went on, other machines were created that could do different codes. So there were definitely more secure codes that were come up with. However, just based on Morse code, it was simple, and that's why it was made. So, and then, yeah, any questions?
So for encoding messages, did they put it in by hand?
Yeah, there's like a little metal thing that you just like tap based on dots or dashes. And that would like go through the wire, and then the other telegraph would like receive it, and then their stylus would print out like the dots and dashes on their tape, I guess, on like their paper roll.
Other questions? Anybody else have other questions? I have one. Can you go back? Just one slide is fine, I think. Two slides, one more.
Yeah.
So in the American Morse code, like for example, I'm looking at the Y and the Z. Is that like a small pause in between to differentiate those because they're both 4 dots, or do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, because the dot, like the second and third are more spread out. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be. And then I think when I was reading too, a pause or like a space in between words or something was equivalent to 4 dashes, I believe.
Okay.
So then I think when it's still like the same letter, I think it's equivalent to only one like pause or 1 dash, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So the dashes between words were longer. Yeah.
Gotcha. Makes sense. All right. Anybody else? Other questions?
Were there ever any encryption methods used when sending Morse code, or is it all just straight? I guess, I mean, people were putting this in by hand, so it'd be kind of hard to encrypt.
Yeah, not that I really came up with. I mean, I really just focused on like the basics of Morse code and like how it was used. There are different codes that like were still used by the telegraph that were more secure. So I guess that was probably like the more secure ways. I guess I didn't really see anything about like just encrypting like Morse code itself. So.
All right. Thank you. I will let you stop sharing your screen.